Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. When manipulators fall for their victims. Stockholm Syndrome is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where victims of abuse or captivity develop emotional bonds with their captors. However, a lesser-known but equally intriguing phenomenon exists. Reverse Stockholm Syndrome, where the manipulator or abuser develops an emotional attachment or empathy toward their victim. This phenomenon has significant implications in psychology, criminology, and interpersonal relationships, often blurring the lines between control and vulnerability. Understanding Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. Reverse Stockholm Syndrome occurs when an individual in a position of power, such as a kidnapper, abuser, or manipulator, begins to sympathize with, care for, or even fall in love with their victim. While this might seem paradoxical, it stems from several psychological factors, including guilt, prolonged emotional exposure, and the human tendency to rationalize actions in order to maintain self-image. Unlike traditional Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim's bond is a survival mechanism, Reverse Stockholm Syndrome can result in the abuser losing control over their intended dominance. In extreme cases, it can even lead to self-sabotage, remorse, or defection from their original manipulative intent. Psychological mechanisms behind Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. Several psychological mechanisms contribute to the development of Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. Cognitive dissonance. The manipulator initially justifies their actions through a belief system that supports dominance and control. However, as they spend more time with their victim, they may begin to perceive them as a human being rather than an object of subjugation. This creates an internal conflict, forcing the manipulator to either dehumanize or empathize with their victim. In cases where empathy takes hold, emotional attachment forms. Emotional proximity and familiarity. Extended interaction often leads to a sense of familiarity. As the abuser shares prolonged exposure with their victim, they may begin to relate to them on a personal level. This effect is similar to the mere exposure effect, where repeated exposure to a person or idea fosters a preference for it. Guilt and moral conflict. While not all abusers experience remorse, those who do may develop emotional attachment as a way to cope with their guilt. In an attempt to justify their actions, they may shift from being a strict oppressor to a reluctant protector. Power imbalance and dependency. In some cases, the manipulator begins to depend on the victim emotionally. If the victim exhibits kindness, submission, or understanding, the abuser may start to seek their approval, reversing the original power dynamic. Real-world examples of Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. While not as commonly discussed as traditional Stockholm Syndrome, instances of Reverse Stockholm Syndrome have been observed in various settings. Kidnappings and hostage situations. There have been cases where captors have released their hostages out of sympathy or even formed lasting emotional bonds with them. Abusive relationships. In toxic relationships, an abuser who initially exerts control may later develop guilt-induced affection for their victim, making it difficult for them to continue their abuse without internal conflict. Cult leaders and their followers. Some cult leaders who initially manipulate their followers for power may become emotionally dependent on them, struggling to maintain dominance as their attachment deepens. Interrogation and espionage. There have been reports of interrogators or spies forming emotional connections with their targets, leading to compromised operations. Consequences of Reverse Stockholm Syndrome. Reverse Stockholm Syndrome can have profound effects on both the manipulator and the victim. Loss of control. A manipulator experiencing empathy may struggle to maintain their initial intentions, sometimes even leading to self-sabotage. Complex emotional ties. The victim may notice the shift in behavior and may use it to their advantage, further complicating the relationship. Moral and psychological conflict. The manipulator may suffer from internal guilt and question their own identity, leading to erratic behavior or a change in mindset. Legal and social ramifications. If an abuser or captor develops a bond and alters their behavior, it could affect legal proceedings, negotiations, and societal perceptions. Reverse Stockholm Syndrome is a fascinating and largely unexamined aspect of human psychology that challenges conventional ideas about power dynamics and control. While the concept is not widely recognized, understanding it provides crucial insights into the complex emotional interplay between abuser and victim. Whether in crime, relationships, or political power struggles, reverse Stockholm Syndrome reveals the unpredictable nature of human emotion and the potential for empathy to emerge in even the darkest of circumstances. Dark mirroring. The predator's imitation game. Mirroring is a natural psychological behavior where individuals subconsciously imitate the gestures, speech patterns, or attitudes of those around them to build rapport and connection. However, when mirroring is weaponized, it becomes a powerful tool for manipulation and deception. This phenomenon, known as dark mirroring, is used by predators to gain trust, control, and ultimately exploit their targets. Unlike genuine mirroring, which fosters empathy and connection, dark mirroring is a strategic imitation designed to infiltrate the psychological defenses of an individual, making them more susceptible to influence. Understanding dark mirroring. Dark mirroring occurs when a manipulator deliberately studies their target's personality, beliefs, habits, and emotional triggers to create a false sense of connection. This calculated imitation is not done out of mutual affinity, but to break down barriers and establish a sense of deep familiarity and trust. Once the victim feels an intense bond, the manipulator can guide them into a state of emotional dependency, making it easier to control and exploit them. Unlike traditional manipulation, which relies on coercion or deceit, dark mirroring is far more insidious and subtle. The victim does not realize they are being manipulated because they believe they have found someone who completely understands and aligns with their deepest thoughts and emotions. Psychological mechanisms behind dark mirroring. Several psychological principles contribute to the effectiveness of dark mirroring. The chameleon effect. Humans are naturally drawn to people who share similarities with them. A predator uses this to create an illusion of compatibility, reinforcing the target's trust. Confirmation. Bias. When someone mirrors our thoughts or beliefs, we naturally assume they are genuine. This makes us blind to red flags or inconsistencies in their behavior. Emotional synchronization. Dark mirroring involves adopting the same emotional states as the victim, making them feel deeply understood. This fosters an almost hypnotic bond that the manipulator can exploit. Trust and vulnerability. Exploitation. By mirroring a victim's insecurities, fears, and desires, manipulators position themselves as the ideal confidant, making the victim more willing to share personal information and depend on them. Real-world examples of dark mirroring. Dark mirroring is commonly seen in various forms of manipulation, including romantic relationships. A manipulative partner mirrors the likes, interests, and personality traits of their victim to quickly establish trust and emotional dependence before revealing their true nature. Cult recruitment. Cult leaders often mirror the beliefs and values of potential followers, making them feel like they have found a home before gradually controlling their thinking. Corporate manipulation. Certain business professionals or salespeople mirror a client's concerns and aspirations to gain trust and influence decisions. Psychopathic behavior. Serial manipulators and predators use mirroring to appear charming and trustworthy, masking their true intentions until their target is fully ensnared. Consequences of dark mirroring. Dark mirroring can have devastating psychological and emotional effects on victims, including emotional dependency. Victims become overly reliant on the manipulator for emotional validation and guidance. Identity erosion. The victim may start questioning their own beliefs and emotions as the manipulator subtly reshapes their worldview. Betrayal trauma. Once the victim realizes they have been deceived, they may experience intense psychological distress, making it difficult to trust others again. Loss of autonomy. A person under the influence of dark mirroring may surrender decision-making power, giving the manipulator full control over their actions and choices. Defending against dark mirroring. Recognizing and defending against dark mirroring requires awareness and vigilance. Here are some key strategies. Be skeptical of instant connections. If someone seems to align with your personality, interests, and emotions too perfectly and too quickly, Consider whether they may be mirroring you intentionally. Observe consistency over time. A manipulator often cannot maintain the facade indefinitely. Look for inconsistencies in their behavior and responses. Trust your instincts. If something feels off about a person despite their seemingly perfect compatibility, listen to your gut. Test authenticity. Share small, false personal details and see if the person adopts them into their mirroring pattern. A genuine person will not. Maintain emotional independence. Do not become emotionally reliant on someone who seems to get you too easily. Build a strong sense of self to resist manipulation. Dark mirroring is a highly effective yet dangerous manipulation technique that preys on human psychology. By creating an illusion of deep connection and trust, predators can infiltrate a victim's mind and emotions, leading to dependency and control. Awareness and skepticism are key defenses against this tactic. Recognizing dark mirroring in relationships, workplaces, or social interactions can prevent emotional exploitation and empower individuals to maintain autonomy over their thoughts and decisions. The Black Swan Manipulation Technique. Unpredictability as a weapon. In the realm of psychological manipulation, most strategies rely on gradual influence and control. However, some manipulators employ a more unpredictable and extreme technique known as the Black Swan Manipulation Technique. Named after the concept of black swan events, rare, unexpected occurrences with significant impact, this form of manipulation hinges on deliberately introducing an unforeseen event that forces a target to reassess their beliefs, emotions, or actions. Unlike conventional manipulation tactics that rely on steady persuasion, Black Swan manipulation thrives on shocking unpredictability to disrupt a person's psychological equilibrium and create an opportunity for control. Understanding the Black Swan Manipulation Technique. Black Swan manipulation involves the calculated introduction of a highly disruptive or shocking event that causes the victim to experience confusion, fear, or emotional instability. This tactic is used to reset the psychological playing field, giving the manipulator an advantage by making the target more susceptible to influence. The key element is surprise. The event is designed to be so unforeseen and significant that it overrides rational decision-making, allowing the manipulator to step in as a source of stability or guidance. Unlike standard psychological manipulation techniques such as gaslighting or guilt tripping, which operate through slow psychological erosion, Black Swan manipulation happens in a single, defining moment that changes the power dynamic between manipulator and victim. Psychological mechanisms behind the Black Swan. Manipulation. Several psychological principles make the Black Swan manipulation technique highly effective. Cognitive overload. The sudden, extreme nature of the event overwhelms the victim's ability to process information rationally, making them more vulnerable to external influence. Emotional hijacking. The event triggers strong emotional responses, such as fear, anxiety, or confusion, which override logical thinking, forcing the victim to rely on external guidance. Shock-induced compliance. When faced with an unpredictable situation, people often look for a leader to provide clarity. The manipulator assumes this role, dictating the victim's next steps. Reality distortion. Because the Black Swan event is so unexpected, the victim may begin to question their prior assumptions, leading them to be more open to new perspectives provided by the manipulator. Reinforcement through repetition. If used multiple times, the technique can create a cycle of dependency, where the victim becomes conditioned to expect unpredictability and relies on the manipulator for stability. Real-world applications of Black Swan manipulation. This technique is not just theoretical. It has been used in various fields and scenarios, including cult indoctrination. Many cults utilize shocking initiation experiences, such as extreme rituals or staged supernatural events, to break down new recruits' psychological defenses. Political propaganda. Sudden, dramatic claims or events are sometimes manufactured to shift public perception and control narratives. Corporate manipulation. Some businesses use last-minute crises or sudden changes in policy to push employees into compliance or distract from underlying issues. Toxic relationships. Manipulative partners may introduce an emotional crisis, e.g., faking an emergency, making false accusations, to destabilize the relationship and regain control. Criminal interrogation and espionage. Sudden, unexpected tactics are used to break down resistance in interrogation settings. Consequences of Black Swan manipulation. The Black Swan manipulation technique can have lasting psychological and emotional consequences for victims, including chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. Victims may begin to expect constant unpredictability, leading to heightened stress levels. Loss of autonomy. Repeated exposure to sudden manipulation can make a victim dependent on the manipulator for emotional stability and decision-making. Erosion of critical thinking. The constant disruption of reality can cause victims to lose trust in their own judgment, making them more susceptible to further manipulation. Emotional trauma and PTSD. Victims who undergo extreme Black Swan events may develop long-term trauma from the psychological shock. Defending against Black Swan manipulation. While Black Swan manipulation is difficult to anticipate, there are ways to defend against it. Develop emotional resilience. Strengthening your ability to handle unexpected situations without overreacting can reduce susceptibility to emotional hijacking. Analyze before reacting. When faced with a shocking event, pause and assess whether it could be a manufactured situation designed to influence you. Identify manipulative patterns. Recognizing a history of unexpected crises in a relationship or environment can help detect when someone is using this technique. Seek external perspective. Speaking to a trusted third party can provide clarity and prevent falling into the manipulator's trap. Trust your instincts. If a situation feels artificially orchestrated or too extreme to be real, question the motives behind it. The Black Swan. Manipulation technique is a potent and dangerous tool that thrives on chaos and psychological disruption. By leveraging unpredictable, extreme events, manipulators can create an artificial crisis that forces their victims into compliance or emotional dependency. Understanding this technique is essential for recognizing when it is being used and taking steps to counter its effects. With awareness, skepticism, and emotional resilience, individuals can defend themselves against the power of strategic unpredictability and regain control over their own decisions and beliefs. Emotional quicksand. The illusion of self-reflection. Self-reflection is widely regarded as a fundamental aspect of personal growth, self-awareness, and emotional intelligence. However, when distorted and manipulated, it can turn into a psychological trap, what we call emotional quicksand. This phenomenon occurs when an individual is led into an endless cycle of self-analysis and doubt, effectively trapping them in a state of emotional inertia. Unlike genuine self-reflection, which fosters insight and progress, emotional quicksand creates the illusion of self-awareness while actually undermining confidence and autonomy. Understanding emotional quicksand. Emotional quicksand is a form of manipulative self-reflection, where an individual is made to believe that they must constantly question their thoughts, emotions, and actions. This process is often engineered by external influences, such as a manipulative partner, an overbearing mentor, or a toxic workplace environment, who subtly suggest that the person is never quite good enough or emotionally aware enough. As a result, the victim sinks deeper into self-doubt and emotional paralysis, unable to trust their own judgments. Psychological mechanisms behind emotional quicksand. Several psychological principles contribute to the effectiveness of emotional quicksand. Over-identification with thought processes. The individual begins to mistake constant introspection for progress, believing that the key to improvement lies in endlessly dissecting their emotions. Cognitive loops and paralysis by analysis. The victim gets caught in an unending cycle of asking why without ever reaching a conclusion, preventing decisive action. Self-doubt reinforcement. The more a person questions themselves, the more they begin to distrust their own instincts, making them increasingly dependent on external validation. Guilt and perceived inadequacy. Constantly focusing on perceived flaws fosters a sense of guilt, reinforcing the idea that they are never enough. Learned helplessness. Over time, the victim becomes resigned to their emotional entrapment, believing that self-doubt is an unavoidable part of growth. Real-world examples of emotional quicksand. Emotional quicksand is often used as a tool of manipulation in various scenarios. Toxic relationships. A controlling partner may constantly question their significant other's motives, causing them to second-guess their own feelings and decisions. Workplace manipulation. An oppressive employer may subtly suggest that employees are not self-aware enough, leading them to overanalyze every action instead of asserting themselves. Cult indoctrination. Some religious or ideological groups encourage endless self-questioning as a means of control, ensuring followers never feel worthy enough to leave. Therapeutic abuse. In cases where therapy is misused, certain techniques can make individuals feel trapped in perpetual self-analysis rather than moving toward healing. Consequences of emotional quicksand. The effects of emotional quicksand can be long-lasting and damaging. Emotional exhaustion. Constant introspection drains mental energy, leaving individuals feeling depleted and overwhelmed. Loss of confidence. A person trapped in emotional quicksand may lose faith in their own instincts and decision-making abilities. Social withdrawal. Fear of making the wrong choice may cause individuals to avoid interactions altogether. Susceptibility to external control. Once self-doubt becomes ingrained, the victim becomes highly vulnerable to manipulation and coercion. Defending against emotional quicksand. To protect oneself from emotional quicksand, it is crucial to recognize its patterns and take proactive steps to counteract them. Set boundaries on self-reflection. Not all thoughts require deep analysis. Learn to differentiate between productive reflection and overthinking. Trust your instincts. Instead of endlessly questioning yourself, cultivate confidence in your initial reactions and decisions. Seek external perspective. A trusted friend, mentor, or therapist can provide clarity and help break the cycle of self-doubt. Focus on action. Over-reflection. Growth often comes from doing, not just thinking. Take small steps forward rather than getting stuck in analyzing every emotion. Recognize manipulative patterns. If someone is encouraging excessive self-reflection in a way that erodes your confidence, be mindful of their motives. Emotional quicksand is a deceptive psychological trap that masquerades as self-improvement while subtly undermining self-confidence and autonomy. By fostering excessive self-doubt and overanalysis, it keeps individuals stuck rather than empowering them. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward reclaiming one's sense of self, trusting personal instincts, and moving forward with confidence. The fear currency effect. How fear is used as a tool of control. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions, capable of shaping behaviors, influencing decisions, and even restructuring entire societies. In manipulation and control tactics, fear often operates as a form of currency, an intangible asset used to gain power over individuals or groups. This phenomenon, known as the fear currency effect, explains how fear can be deliberately manufactured, amplified, and weaponized to manipulate people into submission, compliance, or dependency. Understanding the fear currency effect. At its core, the fear currency effect refers to the idea that fear, much like money, holds value in human interactions. When wielded strategically, fear becomes a transactional tool used to gain obedience, loyalty, or influence. The individual or entity creating and controlling the fear benefits from the psychological paralysis it induces in others, ensuring compliance without the need for force. Unlike direct threats or intimidation, which rely on immediate fear, the fear currency effect focuses on sustained fear, keeping individuals in a heightened state of anxiety, uncertainty, and reliance on the manipulator. Psychological mechanisms behind the fear currency effect. Several psychological principles explain why the fear currency effect is so effective. Learned helplessness. When exposed to prolonged fear, individuals may develop a belief that resistance is futile, making them more likely to comply. Survival instincts. Over-rationality. Fear overrides logical thinking, causing people to make emotionally driven decisions rather than rational choices. Hypervigilance and dependency. Individuals kept in a state of fear often seek guidance from those who claim to offer security, thus deepening their dependence on the manipulator. Loss, aversion, fear of loss, whether of safety, reputation, stability, or resources, makes people more likely to obey, even against their better judgment. Group psychology and herd mentality. When fear is instilled in a collective setting, group members reinforce each other's anxieties, amplifying the manipulator's power over them. Real-world applications of the fear currency effect. The fear currency effect is commonly seen in various aspects of society, relationships, and institutions. Political control. Governments and leaders have historically used fear-based narratives, e.g., external threats, economic collapse, terrorism, to justify policies and maintain authority. Media and propaganda. Sensationalist headlines and fear-mongering journalism keep audiences engaged, ensuring higher ratings and political influence. Corporate and workplace manipulation. Employers or organizations may create a culture of fear, e.g., job insecurity, performance threats, to keep employees compliant and overworked. Toxic relationships. Abusive partners often use fear of abandonment, retaliation, or harm to exert control over their victims. Religious and cult influence. Some groups use fear of divine punishment, eternal damnation, or social ostracization to maintain loyalty and obedience. Consequences of the fear currency effect. Long-term exposure to fear as a form of manipulation can lead to severe consequences for individuals and society as a whole. Chronic stress and anxiety. Living under constant fear can lead to physical and psychological health issues. Erosion of free will. Fear diminishes independent thought, making individuals more susceptible to control, moral and ethical compromise. Fear-induced decision-making may cause people to abandon their principles in favor of self-preservation. Division and hostility. Fear-based narratives often create division, turning groups against each other to maintain power structures. Loss of trust in institutions and relationships. When fear is repeatedly used as a tool of control, individuals become disillusioned and distrustful of those in authority. Defending against the fear currency effect. Recognizing and counteracting. The fear currency effect requires both awareness and resilience. Recognize fear manipulation patterns. Be skeptical of individuals or institutions that consistently use fear to control behavior. Develop critical thinking skills. Challenge fear-based narratives with logic, research, and diverse perspectives. Limit exposure to fear-inducing media. Avoid excessive consumption of news, social media, or propaganda designed to provoke anxiety. Strengthen emotional resilience. Learn to manage fear through mindfulness, stress management, and self-reflection. Empower yourself through knowledge. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Educate yourself about the subject being used to instill fear and seek alternative viewpoints. The fear currency effect demonstrates how fear can be used as a strategic tool of influence and control, keeping individuals or entire populations in a state of dependence and submission. Whether in politics, relationships, or media, recognizing the ways fear is manufactured and weaponized is the first step toward breaking free from its grip. By fostering critical thinking, resilience, and emotional independence, individuals can reclaim their autonomy and resist manipulation. The phantom guilt syndrome. When you feel guilty for no reason. Guilt is a natural human emotion that helps regulate behavior, promoting accountability and moral responsibility. However, there are instances where guilt becomes detached from actual wrongdoing, causing individuals to feel guilty for things they never did or for circumstances beyond their control. This phenomenon, known as phantom guilt syndrome, is a psychological manipulation tactic that exploits an individual's conscience, fostering emotional distress, compliance, and dependency. Understanding phantom guilt syndrome. Phantom guilt syndrome occurs when an individual is conditioned to experience guilt irrationally, often due to external influences such as manipulative relationships, societal expectations, or authority figures. Unlike justified guilt, which arises from actual wrongdoing, Phantom guilt is planted by external forces that distort an individual's perception of their moral standing. This technique is frequently used to create a self-regulating mechanism of control, where the victim polices their own thoughts and actions, making them easier to manipulate. Psychological mechanisms behind phantom guilt syndrome. Several psychological processes contribute to the effectiveness of phantom guilt syndrome. False attribution of responsibility. The individual is led to believe they are responsible for events, emotions, or consequences that were never within their control. Emotional gaslighting. Manipulators distort reality, making the victim feel guilty for things that did not happen or were beyond their influence. Conditioned emotional responses. Repeated reinforcement of unwarranted guilt leads to automatic self-blame, even in unrelated situations. Moral exploitation. People with strong ethical values are particularly vulnerable to phantom guilt syndrome, as manipulators use their own conscience against them. Overgeneralization of guilt. The victim internalizes the belief that they are inherently at fault, regardless of the circumstances. Real-world applications of phantom guilt syndrome. Phantom guilt syndrome is frequently employed in various areas of society and interpersonal relationships. Toxic relationships. Controlling partners make their significant other feel guilty for normal behaviors, e.g., spending time with friends, prioritizing personal needs. Parental manipulation. Some parents use guilt to emotionally tether their children, making them feel responsible for their happiness and well-being. Religious indoctrination. Certain belief systems instill pervasive guilt over natural emotions, thoughts, or actions, fostering dependence on the religious institution. Workplace manipulation. Employers may guilt employees into overworking by implying they are letting the company down if they prioritize work-life balance. Social and political narratives. Some ideologies use guilt to control public perception, convincing individuals they are complicit in societal problems regardless of personal actions. Consequences of phantom guilt syndrome. Experiencing prolonged phantom guilt can lead to severe psychological and emotional effects. Chronic anxiety and stress. Constant guilt causes mental and physical exhaustion. Loss of autonomy. The individual becomes dependent on external validation to relieve guilt, diminishing their independence. Reduced self-worth. Continuous self-blame erodes confidence and self-esteem. Emotional paralysis. Fear of causing harm or disappointment leads to indecision and avoidance behaviors. Manipulation, vulnerability. The more someone internalizes guilt, the easier they are to control and exploit. Defending against phantom guilt syndrome. To break free from phantom guilt syndrome, individuals must recognize its patterns and take active steps to counteract it. Identify the source. Determine whether the guilt is rational or if it has been implanted by an external influence. Challenge irrational guilt. Ask yourself, did I truly do something wrong, or am I being led to feel this way? Set boundaries. Recognize when others are using guilt as a tool for control and refuse to accept unwarranted blame. Develop emotional awareness. Distinguish between genuine accountability and imposed guilt. Seek external validation. Consult unbiased friends, mentors, or therapists to gain perspective on the validity of your guilt. Phantom guilt syndrome is a powerful psychological manipulation tactic that preys on an individual's moral conscience, distorting their perception of responsibility. By recognizing the signs and implementing self-awareness, boundary setting, and rational thinking, individuals can break free from unwarranted guilt and regain control over their emotional well-being. Understanding this phenomenon is key to fostering healthy relationships, personal autonomy, and emotional resilience. Emotional time bombing, the delayed impact of psychological manipulation. Emotional time bombing is a psychological manipulation tactic where an individual plants emotional triggers in someone's mind, ensuring that distressing thoughts, doubts, or fears resurface at a later time. Unlike immediate emotional manipulation, this tactic is designed for long-term influence, allowing manipulators to control their target's emotions and decisions well into the future. The unpredictability of these emotional explosions keeps the victim in a state of uncertainty, making them more susceptible to influence and control. Understanding emotional time bombing. Emotional time bombing works by embedding psychological triggers, words, gestures, or even memories that remain dormant until a specific event, emotional state, or external reminder activates them. The technique ensures that the target experiences distress, guilt, or confusion long after the manipulator has initially planted the seed. This creates a cycle of manipulation in which the victim's emotional stability is continuously compromised. Psychological mechanisms behind emotional time. Bombing. Several psychological principles make emotional time bombing an effective form of manipulation. Delayed conditioning. The victim associates certain thoughts or behaviors with negative emotions, reinforcing a manipulative agenda over time. The Zeigarnik effect. Unresolved emotional experiences tend to resurface unexpectedly, making victims feel a loss of control. Anchoring and triggers. Specific phrases, sounds, or situations become associated with past emotional manipulation, ensuring that the distress is revived whenever those cues appear. Cognitive dissonance. The victim experiences internal conflict when past emotions suddenly resurface, making them doubt their choices and perceptions. Compounded anxiety. The unpredictability of these emotional triggers leads to chronic stress, making victims more dependent on the manipulator for emotional relief. Real-world applications of emotional time bombing. This form of psychological manipulation is often seen in various social dynamics. Toxic relationships. A manipulative partner may remind their significant other of past mistakes or failures at key moments, ensuring lingering guilt and compliance. Parent-child dynamics. Parents may use emotional time bombing to make their children feel perpetual guilt or obligation, even when physically apart. Workplace manipulation. A boss or colleague might bring up past failures or vague criticisms just before important projects, triggering stress and self-doubt. Cult and religious indoctrination. Some groups implant deep-seated fears of punishment or failure that resurface long after members leave. Political and social manipulation. Certain narratives use fear-based tactics that activate distress and compliance long after the initial message is delivered. Consequences of emotional time. Bombing. Victims of emotional time bombing often suffer from long-term psychological and emotional damage, heightened anxiety and stress. The unpredictability of emotional triggers keeps individuals in a state of constant worry. Emotional exhaustion, repeated exposure to past emotional trauma, wears down a person's resilience over time. Loss of trust in one's own judgment. Victims begin questioning their perceptions, making them easier to manipulate in the future. Dependence on the manipulator. Since the manipulator can also provide temporary emotional relief, the victim may feel stuck in the toxic dynamic. Difficulty moving on. Emotional time. Bombs prevent individuals from healing fully, ensuring that past manipulation continues to affect their decisions and self-worth. Defending against emotional time bombing. To counteract the effects of emotional time bombing, individuals must take active steps to reclaim their mental autonomy. Recognize the pattern. Identify when emotions are being triggered by external cues rather than genuine present concerns. Deconstruct emotional triggers. Work through unresolved emotions intentionally rather than allowing them to control responses. Practice mindfulness. By staying present in the moment, individuals can separate past manipulations from current realities. Limit. Contact with manipulators. Distance from toxic influences helps reduce exposure to emotional triggers. Seek support. Talking to a therapist or trusted friend can help process lingering emotional wounds and break the cycle of manipulation. Emotional time bombing is a dangerous and insidious form of psychological control that ensures a manipulator's influence long after an interaction has ended. By planting emotional triggers that resurface unpredictably, manipulators keep their victims trapped in cycles of distress, guilt, and self-doubt. Recognizing this tactic and actively working to dismantle its effects is crucial for regaining emotional independence and mental resilience. Emotional boomerang effect. When manipulated emotions come back to haunt you. Emotions are powerful tools that shape human behavior, relationships, and decision-making. However, in the hands of a manipulator, emotions can be weaponized in ways that cause profound psychological distress. One such manipulation tactic is the emotional boomerang effect, in which a manipulator intentionally provokes a strong emotional reaction in their target, only to later use that very reaction as evidence against them. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the victim is made to feel guilty, irrational, or overly sensitive for reacting to an intentionally crafted emotional trigger. Understanding the emotional boomerang effect. The emotional boomerang effect occurs when a person deliberately elicits an emotional response from another individual and later uses that reaction against them. The goal of this tactic is to undermine the victim's emotional credibility. By portraying their reaction as excessive or unwarranted, the manipulator makes them question their own emotions. Create a cycle of self-doubt. The victim starts second-guessing their own responses and becomes hesitant to express emotions in the future. Reinforce control and power dynamics. By making the victim feel like they are the problem, the manipulator strengthens their dominance. Redirect accountability. The focus shifts from the manipulator's harmful actions to the victim's reaction, making the latter appear unreasonable or unstable. Emotionally exhaust the target. Over time, the victim becomes reluctant to engage in emotional expression, further isolating them. Psychological mechanisms behind the emotional boomerang effect. This manipulation tactic works through several psychological principles. Gaslighting. The victim is made to question whether their emotions were valid or if they overreacted. Projection. The manipulator deflects responsibility by accusing the victim of the very behavior they provoked. Shame induction. Making the victim feel guilty for expressing emotions reinforces emotional suppression. Intermittent reinforcement. Occasional validation mixed with criticism confuses the victim, keeping them emotionally dependent on the manipulator's approval. Cognitive dissonance. The victim struggles to reconcile their emotions with the manipulator's portrayal of events, leading to internal conflict and mental exhaustion. Real-world applications of the emotional boomerang effect. This tactic is commonly employed in various relationships and social structures. Toxic romantic relationships. A partner might intentionally provoke jealousy or anger, and then blame the other for being irrational or controlling. Workplace manipulation. A boss might overload an employee with stress and then call them unprofessional for showing frustration. Parent-child dynamics. A parent might trigger guilt in a child and later accuse them of being ungrateful when they express their feelings. Friendship conflicts. A friend might intentionally bring up a sensitive topic and later dismiss any reaction as being too emotional. Political and social manipulation. Leaders or media figures may incite fear or outrage in people and then criticize them for overreacting or being irrational. Consequences of the emotional boomerang effect. Long-term exposure to this manipulation can have severe effects on a person's emotional well-being. Emotional repression. The victim becomes hesitant to express feelings, fearing that they will be used against them. Loss of self-trust. The individual struggles to trust their own emotions and reactions, leading to chronic self-doubt. Increased anxiety and stress. The uncertainty of whether emotions will be weaponized causes heightened emotional distress. Depression and isolation. Over time, the victim may withdraw from relationships to avoid further manipulation. Greater susceptibility to further manipulation. The victim becomes more vulnerable to other psychological control tactics, defending against the emotional boomerang effect. Recognizing and countering this tactic is key to regaining emotional autonomy. Identify patterns. Recognizing when your emotions are being used against you is the first step to breaking free from manipulation. Validate your own emotions. Remind yourself that your feelings are real and justified, regardless of external attempts to discredit them. Set boundaries. Refuse to engage with those who intentionally provoke you and later blame you for reacting. Seek support. Talk to trusted friends, therapists, or mentors to gain an external perspective on your emotional experiences. Hold manipulators accountable. Instead of defending your emotions, call attention to the initial triggering behavior of the manipulator. The emotional boomerang effect is a deceptive manipulation tactic that keeps individuals trapped in cycles of self-doubt and emotional suppression. By recognizing the patterns of this tactic and reclaiming emotional autonomy, individuals can defend themselves against psychological control and cultivate healthier, more authentic relationships. Awareness is the first step toward breaking free from this insidious cycle and regaining confidence in one's emotional reality. Gaslight looping. The endless cycle of self-doubt. Gaslighting is a well-known psychological manipulation tactic that makes victims question their own perceptions, memories, and reality. However, an even more insidious variation exists: gaslight looping. This technique is designed to create a never-ending cycle of self-doubt, where the victim is not only manipulated into questioning their reality, but also manipulated into questioning their right to question at all. This results in a mental prison of uncertainty, where escape feels impossible. Understanding gaslight looping. Gaslight looping occurs when a manipulator repeatedly invalidates a victim's reality in a way that forces them into an endless loop of doubt and correction. Unlike traditional gaslighting, which seeks to distort reality, gaslight looping ensures that even when the victim attempts to regain clarity, their thoughts are again challenged, leading to further confusion. Key characteristics of gaslight looping include perpetual contradiction. The manipulator constantly changes their stance, making it impossible for the victim to settle on a single truth. Reverse gaslighting. When the victim recognizes manipulation, they are gaslit into believing that they are the manipulator. Confusion and reinforcement. The victim is encouraged to believe that confusion itself is proof of their incompetence. Exhaustion. Tactics, constantly forcing the victim to reassess and defend their reality, drains their mental energy, making them more susceptible to further control. Memory corruption. The victim begins to distrust their own recollections, even in unrelated situations. Psychological mechanisms behind gaslight looping. Several psychological principles make gaslight looping highly effective and damaging. Cognitive dissonance. The victim experiences mental distress from holding conflicting beliefs about their own reality, making them more likely to submit to external narratives. Learned helplessness. Over time, the victim stops trying to verify reality and simply accepts the manipulator's version. The illusory truth effect. The more times a false statement is repeated, the more believable it becomes, reinforcing the cycle of doubt. Paralysis by analysis. By continuously forcing the victim to question everything, they become mentally exhausted and unable to take action. Guilt induction. The victim is made to feel guilty for even considering that they might be right, reinforcing their dependence on the manipulator for truth. Real-world applications of gaslight looping. Gaslight looping is found in many different settings and relationships. Abusive relationships. A toxic partner may repeatedly deny past abuse, then accuse the victim of lying when they recall the abuse correctly. Workplace manipulation. An employer may insist that a conversation never took place, only to later say the employee is incompetent for forgetting the agreement. Family dynamics. A parent might claim they never said something harmful, then later blame the child for remembering incorrectly. Political and media manipulation. Governments or media organizations may repeatedly change narratives, making the public doubt their ability to distinguish truth from fiction. Friendship conflicts. A friend may subtly alter past interactions and then accuse the victim of being too sensitive for remembering them differently. Consequences of gaslight looping. Victims of gaslight looping often experience severe psychological effects, including chronic self-doubt. The individual no longer trusts their own perceptions, making independent decision-making difficult. Emotional and mental exhaustion. Constantly questioning reality leads to extreme mental fatigue. Increased dependence on the manipulator. The victim becomes reliant on the gaslighter for guidance, believing their own thoughts are unreliable. Heightened anxiety and depression. The uncertainty and guilt induced by gaslight looping often result in long-term psychological distress, loss of personal identity. The victim may struggle to define who they are, as their thoughts and experiences have been repeatedly invalidated. Defending against gaslight looping. Escaping gaslight looping requires deliberate action and external validation. Document reality. Keep records of conversations, texts, and events to counteract manipulation. Establish objective truths. Identify facts that cannot be changed or distorted, providing a mental anchor. Limit engagement with manipulators. Reduce interactions with those who constantly invalidate your experiences. Seek outside perspective. Talking to trusted friends or therapists can help break the cycle of doubt. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it likely is. Your intuition is a valuable tool in resisting manipulation. Gaslight looping is an extreme form of psychological manipulation that keeps individuals trapped in an endless cycle of self-doubt and reality distortion. By recognizing its patterns and actively working to reclaim personal autonomy, individuals can break free from this cycle and rebuild confidence in their perceptions. Awareness and support are key to overcoming gaslight looping and regaining control over one's sense of reality. Trauma sculpting. The art of engineered psychological wounds. Trauma is often viewed as an unfortunate byproduct of life's hardships, but in the hands of a manipulator, it can become a deliberate tool for control. Trauma sculpting refers to the calculated engineering of emotional wounds, ensuring that a victim remains vulnerable, dependent, and easily manipulated. Unlike spontaneous trauma, which results from unforeseen life events, trauma sculpting is intentional and strategic, often used in abusive relationships, cults, and high-control organizations. Understanding trauma sculpting. Trauma sculpting occurs when a manipulator creates or intensifies emotional distress in another person to shape their thoughts, behaviors, and self-perception. This process ensures that the target remains in a constant state of emotional instability, making them more susceptible to influence. Key elements of trauma sculpting include induced self-doubt. The victim is led to believe they are inadequate or fundamentally flawed. Emotional conditioning. Painful emotional triggers are reinforced repeatedly to keep the victim in a state of distress. Dependence creation. The manipulator presents themselves as the only source of relief, deepening the victim's reliance on them. Intermittent validation. Occasional praise is given to keep the victim hopeful and engaged, prolonging the cycle of abuse. Identity erosion. The victim's self-concept is gradually dismantled and replaced with one that serves the manipulator's agenda. Psychological mechanisms behind trauma sculpting. Trauma sculpting leverages several psychological tactics to achieve long-term influence. Classical conditioning. The victim is trained to associate certain thoughts or behaviors with punishment, reinforcing control. The Stockholm effect. Trauma. Bonding keeps the victim emotionally attached to their manipulator, even in the face of harm. Cognitive dissonance. The victim struggles to reconcile the trauma with the occasional kindness from the manipulator, trapping them in mental conflict. Hypervigilance induction. Keeping the victim in a state of stress ensures they are always bracing for the next emotional attack. Emotional fragmentation. The victim's emotions are manipulated in such a way that they no longer trust their own instincts or perceptions. Real-world applications of trauma sculpting. Trauma sculpting is commonly seen in abusive relationships. A partner may systematically tear down their victim's self-esteem to maintain dominance. Cult indoctrination. Leaders use trauma to break down individuality and foster absolute loyalty. Toxic family dynamics. Parents may employ guilt, shame, or fear to keep children emotionally bound to them. Workplace manipulation. A superior may use intimidation and psychological abuse to control employees' behavior. Political and social control. Governments or groups may engineer societal traumas to ensure compliance and fear-driven loyalty. Consequences of trauma sculpting. The long-term effects of trauma sculpting can be devastating. Loss of autonomy. The victim struggles to make decisions independently. Chronic anxiety and depression. The constant emotional turmoil leads to mental health deterioration. Identity confusion. The victim may lose touch with their true self, adopting an identity dictated by the manipulator. Learned helplessness. The victim becomes passive, believing they are powerless to change their situation. susceptibility to further manipulation. Once conditioned, the victim becomes easier to control in future relationships and environments. Defending against trauma sculpting. Breaking free from trauma sculpting requires self-awareness and active resistance. Recognize the patterns. Identifying the manipulation tactics is the first step toward breaking free. Rebuild self-identity. Engaging in self-discovery and self-affirmation helps counteract the identity erosion. Seek external support. Trusted friends, therapists, or support groups can provide crucial validation and guidance. Establish firm boundaries. Limiting or cutting off contact with the manipulator helps break the trauma cycle. Rewire emotional responses. Therapy and mindfulness techniques can help recondition emotional reactions to triggers. Trauma sculpting is a dangerous and calculated form of psychological manipulation that ensures long-term control over a victim's emotions and decisions. By recognizing its mechanisms and actively working to reclaim emotional autonomy, individuals can break free from its grip and rebuild their sense of self. Awareness, resilience, and external support are key tools in dismantling the chains of engineered trauma. The Dopamine-Leash Technique. Controlling behavior through intermittent rewards. Dopamine is the brain's reward chemical, responsible for pleasure, motivation, and reinforcement of behavior. While it plays a crucial role in learning and positive reinforcement, it can also be weaponized for manipulation and control. The Dopamine-Leash Technique is a psychological tactic used to create dependency by strategically controlling the release of dopamine in a target, ensuring their attachment to a manipulator. This technique is commonly used in abusive relationships, cults, workplaces, and social dynamics where control is a priority. Understanding the Dopamine-Leash Technique. The Dopamine-Leash Technique exploits the brain's reward system by intermittently providing validation, affection, or success, ensuring that the target remains hooked on the occasional high. By keeping the reward unpredictable but possible, the victim develops a psychological dependency, much like a gambler addicted to slot machines. Key characteristics of the Dopamine-Leash Technique include intermittent reinforcement. Positive feedback is given inconsistently, making the target crave validation. Emotional withholding. Affection, attention, or praise is deliberately withdrawn after creating emotional dependence. Creating cravings. The target begins to chase validation, believing they must earn their worth. Punishment-reward cycling. The manipulator alternates between affection and emotional neglect to maintain control. Psychological hooking. The unpredictability of rewards strengthens emotional attachment, making the victim more likely to comply. Psychological mechanisms behind the Dopamine-Leash Technique. Several psychological principles make the Dopamine-Leash Technique highly effective. Intermittent reinforcement. The target is conditioned to seek validation because they never know when it will be given next. Variable ratio reward system. Similar to gambling addiction, unpredictable rewards create a powerful craving cycle. Operant conditioning. The target's behavior is shaped through rewards and punishments, reinforcing desired responses. Fear of abandonment. The manipulator ensures that withdrawal of validation creates enough distress to force compliance. Cognitive dissonance. The victim rationalizes their mistreatment by focusing on the occasional positive moments. Real-world applications of the Dopamine-Leash Technique. This technique is used in various manipulative settings. Abusive relationships. A partner alternates between extreme affection and emotional coldness, ensuring their victim stays attached. Workplace manipulation. Employers or supervisors provide occasional praise but keep employees in a state of constant self-doubt. Social media and tech platforms. Platforms use unpredictable likes, comments, and algorithm boosts to keep users engaged and addicted. Cult and group control. Leaders create cycles of approval and rejection to keep followers emotionally invested. Parental or familial manipulation. Some parents condition children to chase their love and approval by giving it sparingly. Consequences of the Dopamine-Leash Technique. Long-term exposure to this manipulation can have serious effects. Emotional dependence. The victim relies on the manipulator for self-worth and happiness. Low self-esteem. The irregular reinforcement makes the victim believe they must earn love or validation, anxiety, and obsession. The unpredictability creates a state of constant emotional craving and stress, loss of autonomy. The victim's decisions become centered around pleasing the manipulator, susceptibility to further manipulation. Once conditioned, the victim is more likely to fall into similar toxic dynamics. Defending against the Dopamine-Leash Technique. Breaking free from this cycle requires conscious effort and awareness. Recognize the pattern. Identifying when intermittent reinforcement is being used against you is the first step. Rebuild self-worth. Learning to find validation internally instead of externally weakens the manipulator's grip. Limit exposure to the manipulator. Reducing contact with those who use this technique helps break the cycle. Strengthen emotional independence. Developing a stable sense of self decreases the need for external validation. Seek external support. Trusted friends, therapy, and self-affirmation techniques help regain control over your emotional well-being. The Dopamine-Leash Technique is a powerful psychological manipulation tactic that exploits the brain's reward system to create emotional dependence. By recognizing and resisting intermittent reinforcement, individuals can regain control over their emotions, build self-worth, and break free from the toxic cycle of psychological conditioning. Awareness and conscious action are the keys to escaping this insidious form of manipulation. Mindstringing, psychological puppetry, and the art of control. Mindstringing is a covert psychological manipulations tactic where an individual pulls the mental and emotional strings of their target, ensuring they behave in a predictable and controlled manner. Unlike overt coercion, mindstringing operates in the shadows, using subtle cues, emotional triggers, and behavioral conditioning to direct a person's thoughts and actions. This technique is often used in abusive relationships, high-control organizations, and even mass influence strategies, ensuring the target is emotionally tethered to the manipulator. Understanding mind-stringing. Mind-stringing relies on the systematic installation of thought loops, emotional dependencies, and behavioral rewards that condition the victim to act in ways that benefit the manipulator. Over time, the victim's ability to think independently is eroded, making them psychologically tethered to the manipulator's influence. Key characteristics of mind-stringing include thought implantation. The victim is subtly influenced to believe certain ideas are their own, even when they originated from the manipulator. Emotional leash. The target is conditioned to crave approval or avoid disapproval from the manipulator. Behavioral autopilot. The manipulator reinforces behaviors that serve their purpose, making them second nature to the victim. Strategic contradiction. The victim is constantly thrown into a state of confusion, making them more dependent on the manipulator for clarity. Learned compliance. The victim is programmed to seek guidance from the manipulator before making decisions, even minor ones. Psychological mechanisms behind mind-stringing. Several psychological principles contribute to the effectiveness of mind-stringing. Operant conditioning. The victim is rewarded for desirable behavior and subtly punished for independent thought. Intermittent reinforcement. Like the Dopamine-Leash Technique, the manipulator alternates between approval and withdrawal to strengthen control. Cognitive dissonance. The victim is made to accept contradictory truths, which forces them into a state of confusion and compliance. Gaslighting reinforcement. The manipulator controls the victim's perception of reality by constantly shifting the narrative. Emotional string tugging. The manipulator uses praise, guilt, fear, or shame to create emotional dependency. Real-world applications of mind-stringing. Mind-stringing can be found in a variety of manipulative social structures, including toxic relationships. A partner uses emotional manipulation to keep the other from leaving or asserting independence. Workplace mind control. A manipulative employer keeps employees questioning their competence, ensuring they never seek better opportunities. Religious or cultic indoctrination. Followers are kept mentally tied to the organization through selective approval, fear, and program beliefs. Family narcissism. Parents or guardians subtly dictate their children's worldview, ensuring lifelong emotional dependence. Mass media and political influence. Narratives are crafted to control public perception and shape behavioral patterns. Consequences of mind stringing. Victims of mind stringing often suffer from significant psychological and emotional damage. Loss of identity. The victim begins to adopt the manipulator's thoughts and values as their own. Chronic self-doubt. They second-guess every decision, fearing they might displease the manipulator. Anxiety and depression. Constant emotional strain leads to a decline in mental health. Dependency on the manipulator. The victim loses the ability to make independent decisions, seeking validation at every turn. Fear of autonomy. The idea of thinking freely becomes intimidating because it has been systematically discouraged. Defending against mind stringing. Breaking free from mind stringing requires conscious effort and external support. Recognize the manipulation. Identifying thought patterns and behaviors that don't feel truly authentic is the first step. Reassert personal identity. Engage in self-exploration to rediscover independent thoughts and beliefs. Limit contact with the manipulator. Reducing exposure to the source of mind stringing weakens its effect. Seek external perspective. A therapist or trusted friend can help challenge manipulated thought patterns. Practice decision-making autonomy. Start with small, independent choices to rebuild confidence and self-reliance. Mind stringing is a powerful yet insidious form of psychological puppetry that erodes autonomy and ensures control through subtle mental conditioning. By recognizing the tactics used and taking deliberate steps toward mental independence, individuals can break free from the strings of manipulation and reclaim their sense of self. Awareness, personal empowerment, and external support are crucial tools in resisting this form of psychological bondage. Reverse empathy exploitation. When compassion becomes a weapon, empathy is widely regarded as one of the most valuable human traits, fostering connection, understanding, and emotional depth. However, in the hands of manipulators, empathy can be twisted into a tool for control. Reverse empathy exploitation occurs when an individual weaponizes their own exaggerated sense of empathy to manipulate others into submission, guilt, or compliance. Unlike traditional emotional manipulation, which often involves gaslighting or deception, this technique forces the victim into a psychological state where they feel responsible for the manipulator's well-being, often at the cost of their own. Understanding reverse empathy exploitation. In reverse empathy exploitation, the manipulator projects themselves as the more empathetic and morally superior person, making the victim feel selfish, unkind, or emotionally inadequate. The goal is to establish an imbalance in emotional power, where the victim is conditioned to prioritize the manipulator's emotions above their own. Key characteristics of reverse empathy exploitation include moral superiority claims. The manipulator presents themselves as more emotionally aware, making the victim feel emotionally deficient. Guilt induction. The victim is made to feel guilty for not being empathetic enough. Self-sacrificial illusion. The manipulator frequently highlights how much they give emotionally, subtly suggesting the victim is failing to do the same. Emotional burden shifting. The victim feels responsible for managing the manipulator's emotions, leading to chronic self-sacrifice. Compassion fatigue. Over time, the victim becomes emotionally exhausted from constantly prioritizing the manipulator's needs. Psychological mechanisms behind reverse empathy exploitation. Several psychological principles contribute to the effectiveness of this manipulation tactic. Cognitive dissonance. The victim struggles to reconcile their natural empathy with the manipulator's accusations of selfishness. Guilt conditioning. Repeated exposure to guilt. Base narratives conditions the victim to believe they are constantly falling short. Emotional contagion. The manipulator amplifies their own distress, making the victim feel compelled to fix the situation. Martyr complex manipulation. The manipulator frames themselves as a perpetual giver, subtly reinforcing the expectation that the victim must reciprocate unconditionally. Learned compliance. Over time, the victim accepts that prioritizing their own emotions is selfish, reinforcing an unhealthy power dynamic. Real-world applications of reverse empathy exploitation. This technique is frequently seen in various forms of relationships and social structures. Toxic romantic relationships. One partner manipulates the other into feeling selfish for setting boundaries or prioritizing their own needs. Family manipulation. Parents or siblings guilt a family member into constant emotional labor under the guise of love. Workplace exploitation. A boss or colleague claims emotional hardship to excuse poor behavior, expecting others to accommodate their emotions. Political and social influence. Leaders or influencers portray themselves as deeply empathetic while shaming dissenters for lacking compassion. Friendship guilt traps. A friend constantly reminds others of how much they give, ensuring ongoing loyalty and submission. Consequences of reverse empathy exploitation. Victims of this manipulation often suffer severe psychological and emotional consequences, including emotional exhaustion. The constant demand to be empathetic drains mental energy. Identity erosion. The victim loses touch with their own emotional needs and boundaries. Chronic guilt and anxiety. A pervasive sense of guilt makes the victim hesitant to assert themselves. Loss of autonomy. The victim becomes conditioned to seek the manipulator's approval before making decisions. Difficulty trusting future relationships. The victim may become wary of empathy itself, fearing further exploitation. Defending against reverse empathy exploitation. Breaking free from reverse empathy. Exploitation requires awareness and deliberate action. Recognize the pattern, identifying guilt. Inducing manipulation is the first step toward reclaiming emotional independence. Set and enforce boundaries. Prioritizing personal well-being does not equate to selfishness. Reaffirm emotional autonomy. Acknowledge that empathy should be mutual, not weaponized. Limit engagement with manipulative individuals. Reducing exposure to emotional manipulators weakens their control. Seek external perspective. Therapy or trusted friends can provide validation and help break the cycle of guilt conditioning. Reverse empathy exploitation is a powerful yet insidious form of psychological control that turns compassion into a weakness. By recognizing and resisting the guilt-based tactics employed by manipulators, individuals can reclaim their emotional independence and foster healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than forced emotional servitude. Understanding the distinction between genuine empathy and manipulation is key to protecting oneself from this covert psychological weapon. Cognitive shapeshifting. The art of mental adaptation and deception. Cognitive shapeshifting is a psychological manipulation tactic where an individual constantly alters their beliefs, opinions, and persona, depending on their audience, environment, or strategic needs. Unlike traditional deception, where lies are carefully crafted and maintained, cognitive shapeshifting involves a fluid and ever-changing mental state, making it difficult for others to pinpoint the manipulator's true intentions. This tactic is commonly used by narcissists, cult leaders, politicians, and social manipulators who seek to control narratives, evade accountability, or gain influence over others. Understanding cognitive shapeshifting. Cognitive shapeshifters exhibit an adaptive mental flexibility, allowing them to blend into different social and ideological environments without appearing disingenuous. This enables them to maintain power, manipulate trust, and navigate conflicting interests without being detected. Key characteristics of cognitive shapeshifting include situational identity shifting. The individual presents different versions of themselves to different people, ensuring they remain agreeable in any context. Belief fluidity. They rapidly change their views based on who they are speaking to, making them appear aligned with others' perspectives. Manipulative chameleon effect. Their ability to mirror values, speech patterns, and emotions creates artificial rapport and trust. Defensive evasion. When confronted, they deny past statements or claim they were misunderstood, keeping their narrative unchallengeable. Strategic contradiction. They hold conflicting opinions at different times, using ambiguity to confuse and control conversations. Psychological mechanisms behind cognitive shapeshifting. Several psychological principles make cognitive shapeshifting an effective tool for manipulation. Cognitive dissonance exploitation. By presenting different realities to different audiences, they force others to rationalize inconsistencies. Gaslighting reinforcement. The manipulator denies ever saying something contradictory, making their targets question their own memory and perception. Social mimicry. They unconsciously or deliberately adopt the behaviors, speech, and interests of their target to establish rapport and influence. Reality distortion field. They create a shifting perception of reality, making it hard for others to hold them accountable for inconsistencies. Persuasive anchoring. By carefully introducing and modifying their narratives over time, they condition others to accept contradictions as evolution rather than deception. Real-world applications of cognitive shapeshifting. This manipulation tactic is prevalent in various environments, including political manipulation. Politicians frequently adjust their policies and rhetoric depending on their audience to gain favor and avoid scrutiny. Corporate deception. Some executives alter their leadership style and moral stance to appease stakeholders while concealing true intentions. Cult and religious control. Leaders shift doctrines or reinterpret teachings to maintain authority and keep followers aligned with their changing goals. Toxic relationships. Manipulative partners shift between affectionate and hostile personas, keeping their victims emotionally dependent. Social media influence. Online influencers alter their messaging to appeal to different demographics while maintaining the illusion of consistency. Consequences of cognitive shapeshifting. Victims of cognitive shapeshifting often experience chronic confusion and doubt. Constant contradictions lead to uncertainty and self-doubt. Erosion of trust. People struggle to trust the shapeshifter due to their shifting personas and narratives. Inability to hold manipulators accountable. Since the shapeshifter never commits fully to any stance, confronting them becomes impossible. Emotional and psychological exhaustion. Keeping up with the shifting reality of the manipulator leads to mental fatigue. Loss of autonomy. Victims may feel trapped, relying on the manipulator to define what is true in different contexts. Defending against cognitive shapeshifting. Breaking free from the influence of a cognitive shapeshifter requires awareness and strategic resistance. Document inconsistencies. Keeping track of past statements helps identify shifting narratives and manipulation patterns. Challenge contradictions directly. Calling out inconsistencies forces the manipulator to reveal their true stance. Trust concrete actions over words. Pay attention to behavioral patterns rather than shifting rhetoric. Seek external validation. Discussing concerns with trusted friends or mentors can provide clarity. Cognitive shapeshifting is an advanced psychological manipulation and strategy that enables individuals to evade accountability, gain trust, and manipulate perceptions by altering their persona, beliefs, and behaviors in response to social and situational demands. Recognizing this tactic and setting boundaries against those who use it is essential for maintaining mental clarity, personal autonomy, and emotional well-being. Hypernormalization Tactic. The illusion of stability in a manufactured reality. Hypernormalization is a psychological and socio-political manipulations tactic where an artificial and absurd reality is gradually introduced and accepted as normal. This strategy works by normalizing contradictions, deception, and systemic dysfunction until individuals and societies become desensitized and resigned to distorted truths. The term, originally coined to describe Soviet-era propaganda techniques, has expanded to include political, corporate, and social manipulation, shaping public perception and suppressing dissent. Understanding hypernormalization. Hypernormalization occurs when an unnatural or misleading state of affairs is repeatedly presented as inevitable or natural. Over time, individuals begin to accept contradictions and illogical narratives as a normal part of life. This leads to widespread apathy, disengagement, and compliance, as resisting an increasingly absurd reality feels futile. Key characteristics of hypernormalization include gradual erosion of truth. Falsehoods and contradictions are slowly introduced until they blend seamlessly into everyday reality. Desensitization to absurdity. Repeated exposure to illogical or irrational policies, statements, or behaviors makes them appear normal over time. Controlled narrative shifting. The manipulator controls the perception of reality by altering the context and meaning of events. Perpetual crisis management. The population remains in a constant state of confusion, preventing them from critically analyzing the situation. Social and cognitive fatigue. Individuals become exhausted from questioning contradictions and ultimately accept the distorted version of reality as the path of least resistance. Psychological mechanisms behind hypernormalization. Hypernormalization is highly effective due to several cognitive and social mechanisms. The Overton window shift, manipulators gradually push the boundaries of what is considered acceptable discourse, making the previously unthinkable seem normal. Cognitive dissonance suppression. The discomfort of holding conflicting beliefs is mitigated by adopting the narrative that offers the least resistance. Normalization of dysfunction. When societal dysfunction becomes routine, individuals stop perceiving it as a problem that needs fixing. Learned helplessness. Prolonged exposure to an unchangeable or chaotic reality discourages people from challenging the status quo. Echo chamber reinforcement. Constant exposure to controlled narratives through media, education, and social structures solidifies belief in the manufactured reality. Real-world applications of hypernormalization. Hypernormalization tactics are found in numerous areas of society, influencing public perception and maintaining control. Political propaganda. Governments create artificial narratives to distract from systemic failures while portraying themselves as stabilizing forces. Corporate manipulation. Businesses normalize exploitative practices by making them appear as industry standards or economic necessities. Social media influence. Online platforms shape public perception by amplifying specific narratives while suppressing dissenting views. Cultural and ideological control. Certain ideologies are gradually imposed as the only rational perspective, making alternative viewpoints appear extremist. Economic systems. Financial instability and inequality are framed as unavoidable, preventing meaningful systemic change. Consequences of hypernormalization. Long-term exposure to hypernormalized realities can have severe psychological and societal consequences. Loss of critical thinking. People accept distorted realities without questioning them, leading to intellectual stagnation, widespread apathy, and compliance. As absurdity becomes normalized, individuals feel powerless to resist or change their circumstances. Manipulated perception of reality. The inability to distinguish truth from manipulation fosters cynicism and distrust. Social fragmentation. People who reject hypernormalized narratives become alienated or discredited by the manipulated majority. Perpetuation of dysfunctional systems. Societies remain trapped in cycles of deception and exploitation because challenging the status quo feels impossible. Defending against hypernormalization. Breaking free from hypernormalization requires conscious resistance and critical awareness. Question official narratives, challenge contradictions, and seek alternative perspectives rather than blindly accepting mainstream discourse. Analyze patterns of manipulation. Recognize recurring tactics used to shift public perception over time. Engage in independent thinking. Develop critical reasoning skills to distinguish between authentic and manufactured realities. Strengthen community awareness. Build networks of like-minded individuals who value truth and resist manipulation. Refuse to accept absurdity as normal. Maintain a firm grasp on objective reality and resist the gradual erosion of truth. Hypernormalization is a powerful psychological tactic that reshapes societies by slowly distorting perceptions of reality. By recognizing and resisting these manipulations, individuals can reclaim their ability to think critically, question inconsistencies, and challenge the forces that seek to normalize deception and dysfunction. Awareness, critical engagement, and collective resistance are essential tools for breaking free from the cycle of hypernormalization and restoring clarity to a manipulated world. The insidious guilt drain, a silent manipulation tool. Guilt is a powerful emotion that can foster accountability, morality, and personal growth. However, when weaponized, it becomes a covert manipulation tool, subtly draining individuals of their emotional energy, self-confidence, and autonomy. The insidious guilt drain is a psychological phenomenon in which a manipulator systematically imposes excessive guilt on a target, making them feel perpetually responsible for the well-being and emotions of others. Over time, this emotional drain leaves individuals exhausted, trapped in cycles of self-blame, and more susceptible to control. Understanding the insidious guilt drain. The insidious guilt drain operates in a slow and calculated manner, ensuring that victims do not immediately recognize its impact. Unlike overt emotional abuse, which can be easily identified, this technique works by instilling a constant sense of inadequacy and convincing the victim that they must always do more to prove their worth. Key characteristics of the insidious guilt drain include perpetual self-blame. The target internalizes guilt even for things outside their control. Emotional exhaustion. The constant demand for emotional labor leaves the victim drained. Unrealistic responsibility. The target feels obligated to manage others' emotions and well-being. Subtle guilt induction. The manipulator never explicitly states the blame, but implies it through language, tone, and context. Fear of abandonment. The victim believes that failing to meet unrealistic expectations will result in rejection or conflict. Psychological mechanisms behind the insidious guilt drain. Several psychological mechanisms make this tactic highly effective. Cognitive dissonance. The victim feels the need to justify their guilt by overcompensating, reinforcing the manipulator's control. Gaslighting reinforcement. When the victim questions their excessive guilt, the manipulator convinces them that they are indeed at fault. Intermittent reinforcement. Occasional praise keeps the victim hooked, making them feel that their guilt-induced efforts are worthwhile. Empathy exploitation. The victim's natural compassion is used against them, making them feel selfish for setting boundaries. Emotional dependency creation. The manipulator ensures that the victim remains emotionally reliant on them for validation and relief from guilt. Real-world applications of the insidious guilt drain. This tactic is often seen in various personal and professional relationships. Toxic family dynamics. Parents may guilt-trip children into prioritizing family over their personal well-being. Manipulative romantic relationships. Partners may use guilt to keep the other emotionally and physically invested. Workplace exploitation. Employers may impose guilt on employees for prioritizing personal time over work. Religious and social control. Institutions may use guilt to ensure obedience and conformity. Friendship manipulation. Friends may guilt-trip others into constantly proving their loyalty. Consequences of the insidious guilt drain. Prolonged exposure to guilt manipulation can have serious psychological and emotional effects. Chronic anxiety and stress. The individual remains in a heightened state of worry and self-criticism. Loss of identity. The victim prioritizes external expectations over personal values. Depression and burnout. The emotional toll results in exhaustion and feelings of hopelessness. Reduced autonomy. The victim struggles to make independent decisions without seeking approval. Susceptibility to further manipulation. Once conditioned, the victim becomes vulnerable to other forms of psychological control. Defending against the insidious guilt drain. Recognizing and countering this manipulation requires awareness and firm boundary setting. Acknowledge manipulation patterns. Identifying recurring guilt-inducing tactics is the first step toward breaking free. Reframe guilt as a manipulative tool. Understand that guilt should not be a constant emotional state. Develop emotional independence. Learn to separate personal responsibility from imposed guilt. Seek external perspective. Talk to trusted friends or therapists for validation and clarity. Enforce boundaries. Establish clear limits on emotional labor, and refuse to engage in guilt-based demands. The insidious guilt drain is a subtle yet highly effective manipulation tactic that leaves individuals emotionally exhausted and mentally vulnerable. By recognizing its patterns and actively resisting guilt-based control, individuals can regain their emotional autonomy and rebuild their self-worth. Awareness, boundary setting, and self-reflection are essential tools in breaking free from this draining cycle and fostering healthier relationships. Fear echo manipulation, the repetition of psychological control. Fear is a powerful tool for control, and when used strategically, it can keep individuals in a heightened state of anxiety and submission. One of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation is fear echo manipulation. a technique where past fears, traumas, or anxieties are subtly echoed in conversations and situations to maintain control over a target. Unlike direct intimidation, fear echo manipulation works through subtle psychological cues that trigger pre-existing emotional distress, reinforcing compliance and emotional dependence. Understanding fear echo manipulation. Fear echo manipulation exploits a person's deep-seated fears by consistently reintroducing them in indirect ways, keeping the individual emotionally destabilized. This tactic is particularly effective because it does not rely on explicit threats, but rather on carefully placed reminders, suggestions, and contextual triggers that bring past fears back to the surface. Key characteristics of fear echo manipulation include triggering past trauma, subtly referencing past painful experiences to elicit an emotional response. Uncertainty reinforcement, introducing fear in an ambiguous manner, making the target unsure of what is real and what is paranoia. Repetitive fear. Associations, using specific words, phrases, or settings that subconsciously link to past distressing events. Emotional exhaustion. Keeping the target in a prolonged state of fear-based stress to limit their cognitive ability to resist. Creating a learned response. Over time, the victim begins to react preemptively to these fear echoes, shaping their behavior to avoid discomfort. Psychological mechanisms behind fear. Echo manipulation. Several psychological principles make fear echo manipulation particularly effective. Classical conditioning. The manipulator pairs specific triggers with fearful emotions, so the target automatically responds with anxiety or compliance. The Zeigarnik effect. The brain remembers unfinished or unresolved events more vividly. Manipulators exploit this by subtly referencing unresolved past traumas. Intermittent reinforcement. Fear cues are introduced sporadically, making the target hypervigilant and unable to predict when manipulation will occur. Cognitive overload. When a person is overwhelmed by constant fear echoes, their ability to rationalize and resist diminishes. Gaslighting reinforcement. When the victim notices these echoes, the manipulator dismisses their concerns as paranoia, making them doubt their own perception. Real-world applications of fear echo manipulation. This technique is commonly employed in various settings. Abusive relationships. A partner may subtly reference past arguments or threats to keep the other person in a state of anxiety. Workplace manipulation. A toxic employer may remind an employee of past failures or terminations to create job insecurity. Political and social control. Governments and media may repeat narratives of past crises to keep the public in a perpetual state of fear. Family manipulation. Parents may repeatedly invoke past mistakes or failures to control their children's decisions. Religious and cult influence. Fear-based doctrines often use historical punishments as reminders to maintain obedience. Consequences of fear echo manipulation. Victims of fear echo. Manipulation suffer from significant psychological and emotional consequences, including chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. The inability to escape the looming presence of past fears leads to constant stress. Loss of autonomy. The victim adjusts their behavior to avoid triggering fear cues, gradually losing personal agency. Heightened susceptibility to further manipulation. The more fear echoes are reinforced, the easier it becomes for manipulators to exert control. Depression and emotional exhaustion. Living in a state of prolonged fear drains mental and physical resources, leading to emotional burnout. Social withdrawal. Victims may isolate themselves to avoid encountering fear triggers, leading to loneliness and dependence on the manipulator. Defending against fear. Echo manipulation. To break free from this cycle, individuals must recognize and actively counteract fear echo manipulation. Identify and document triggers. Keeping track of fear cues and their sources can help victims recognize patterns of manipulation. Rationalize fear associations. Asking whether a fear response is justified in the present moment helps separate past trauma from current reality. Establish boundaries. Removing or limiting interaction with those who repeatedly introduce fear echoes can weaken their influence. Seek external validation. Talking to a trusted friend or therapist can help the victim verify whether their fears are being artificially induced. Challenge the fear cycle. Recognizing that the fear is a tool of manipulation rather than a genuine threat can help regain control over emotional responses. Fear echo manipulation is a subtle but powerful psychological tactic that keeps individuals trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and compliance. By repeatedly echoing past fears and anxieties, manipulators maintain control over their targets without direct coercion. Recognizing and resisting this tactic is essential for reclaiming personal autonomy and emotional freedom. Awareness, rational analysis, and support from trusted individuals are key steps toward breaking free from the grip of fear-based manipulation. Cognitive hijacking. Weaponizing overthinking. Cognitive hijacking is a psychological manipulation tactic that exploits a person's natural tendency to overthink, leading them into a spiral of doubt, analysis paralysis, and mental exhaustion. By intentionally overloading an individual with excessive information, conflicting narratives, or strategic uncertainty, manipulators can control decision-making, suppress autonomy, and create dependency. Unlike direct coercion, cognitive hijacking works subtly, making victims believe they are acting of their own accord, while their cognitive resources are systematically drained. Understanding cognitive hijacking. Cognitive hijacking is rooted in the concept of mental overload, where the mind is flooded with too many variables to process efficiently. Manipulators use this tactic to disrupt critical thinking. By forcing a person to juggle multiple perspectives and contradictory information, their ability to reach a clear conclusion is impaired. Induced decision. Fatigue, overanalyzing every possibility leads to exhaustion, making the victim more likely to comply with external influence. Create self-doubt. Constantly questioning one's own choices or perspectives erodes confidence, making the victim more susceptible to guidance from the manipulator. Divert attention. Keeping someone mentally preoccupied prevents them from recognizing the true intentions behind the manipulation. Establish control. By becoming the voice of clarity in the chaos, the manipulator positions themselves as the authority figure whom the victim must rely on for guidance. Psychological mechanisms behind cognitive hijacking. Several psychological mechanisms make cognitive hijacking effective. The Zeigarnik effect. The brain has a tendency to fixate on unfinished tasks. Manipulators exploit this by keeping the victim in a perpetual state of unresolved thought. Information overload. Too much conflicting information leads to mental exhaustion, making people more likely to defer decisions to an authority figure. The paradox of choice. Too many options create indecision, leaving individuals frozen in fear of making the wrong move. Hyper-rationalization. Overanalyzing every scenario leads to inaction, allowing the manipulator to step in and provide a solution. Emotional anchoring. Manipulators inject emotional triggers into discussions, causing victims to associate stress, fear, or guilt with independent decision-making. Real-world applications of cognitive hijacking. Cognitive hijacking is commonly used in various domains. Toxic relationships. A manipulative partner floods the victim with conflicting emotions and interpretations of events, making them doubt their perceptions. Corporate manipulation. Employers use excessive meetings, vague policies, and impossible expectations to keep employees in a state of compliance. Political propaganda. Leaders and media outlets present overwhelming amounts of conflicting narratives to confuse the public and push desired agendas. Cult indoctrination. By overwhelming recruits with information and moral dilemmas, cults make independent thought feel impossible. Marketing and sales. Companies use complex pricing structures and product comparisons to manipulate consumers into making impulsive decisions. Consequences of cognitive hijacking. Victims of cognitive hijacking often experience long-term psychological and emotional effects. Mental exhaustion. Continuous overthinking drains cognitive energy, leading to stress and burnout. Loss of confidence. A person who constantly second-guesses their choices will struggle to trust their own instincts. Dependency on external authority. The more someone is manipulated into overthinking, the more they rely on the manipulator for answers. Reduced autonomy. The victim may become unable to make independent decisions without excessive deliberation. Heightened anxiety and paralysis. Fear of making the wrong choice creates a cycle of avoidance and inaction. Defending against cognitive hijacking. To break free from cognitive hijacking, individuals must develop awareness and mental resilience. Recognize the pattern. Identify when you are being intentionally overloaded with excessive information or forced into overanalyzing. Simplify decision-making. Limit the number of choices you consider and set deadlines to prevent endless deliberation. Trust your instincts. Avoid the trap of needing absolute certainty before making a decision. Avoid engaging with manipulative narratives. If someone is deliberately complicating your thinking, step back and evaluate their motives. Develop mental boundaries. Consciously decide when to stop thinking about an issue and move forward with action. Cognitive hijacking is a dangerous form of manipulation that weaponizes overthinking to control decision-making and erode autonomy. By recognizing the signs and implementing strategies to counteract excessive mental overload, individuals can protect themselves from falling into the trap of analysis paralysis and regain control over their thought processes. Dark Triad. Anchoring, a manipulative tactic of psychological control. The Dark Triad, comprising narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, is a well-known cluster of personality traits associated with manipulation, deceit, and emotional exploitation. One of the most insidious tactics used by individuals with Dark Triad traits is Dark Triad anchoring, a psychological strategy in which a manipulator intentionally projects these traits onto their target, subtly conditioning them to doubt their own integrity, motivations, and mental stability. Unlike direct manipulation tactics such as gaslighting or guilt tripping, Dark Triad anchoring works by making the victim believe they are the toxic one, causing emotional distress, self-doubt, and increased dependence on the manipulator. Understanding Dark Triad. Anchoring. Dark Triad anchoring involves systematically shifting blame, projecting dark traits onto another person, and making them feel as if they embody these toxic characteristics. This method is used to erode the victim's self-confidence by making someone believe they are narcissistic, manipulative, or callous. Their self-image is distorted, making them more compliant. Redirect suspicion away from the manipulator. When someone is constantly forced to defend themselves against false accusations, they become too distracted to analyze the manipulator's behavior. Create an emotional dependency. Victims often turn to the manipulator for validation or reassurance, cementing their reliance on the very person harming them. Ensure control over perception. The manipulator engineers situations where their victim feels morally compromised, reinforcing the belief that they are the problem. Psychological mechanisms behind Dark Triad. Anchoring. Several psychological principles make Dark Triad anchoring particularly effective. Projection. A classic defense mechanism where the manipulator accuses the victim of having the same traits they themselves possess. Cognitive dissonance. Victims struggle to reconcile their self-perception with the false image imposed on them, leading to emotional instability. The illusory truth effect. Repetition of the same accusations can make the victim start believing them, even if they are baseless. Gaslighting reinforcement. This technique is often used alongside gaslighting, ensuring the victim questions their own memory and perception. Learned helplessness. Over time, the victim may stop resisting and simply accept the manipulator's version of reality as truth. Real-world applications of Dark Triad. Anchoring. Dark Triad anchoring is commonly used in toxic relationships. Manipulative partners may accuse their significant other of selfishness or manipulation, making them feel guilty and powerless. Workplace abuse. A deceptive boss or coworker might suggest an employee is being unethical or disloyal, discrediting them while hiding their own toxic behavior. Family dynamics. Controlling family members may use this tactic to ensure obedience by making a child or sibling feel as though they are a bad person. Social and political spheres. Leaders or influencers may accuse critics of possessing immoral traits to discredit opposition and maintain control. Consequences of dark triad. Anchoring. Long-term exposure to this form of manipulation can have devastating effects on mental health, self-esteem, and autonomy, self-doubt, and emotional instability. The victim constantly questions their own motives and behavior. Isolation. They may withdraw from social interactions to avoid further accusations. Loss of personal identity. Continually being told they are manipulative or toxic leads victims to reshape their identity based on false perceptions. Increased vulnerability to further manipulation. The more someone internalizes false narratives, the easier they become to control. Emotional exhaustion and depression. The mental toll of being accused and gaslit over time can lead to severe emotional distress. Defending against dark triad. Anchoring. Breaking free from dark triad. Anchoring requires awareness, self-trust, and assertive boundary setting. Recognize projection. If someone is accusing you of traits you don't exhibit, ask yourself whether they might be projecting their own behaviors onto you. Seek external validation. Trusted friends or therapists can help provide an objective perspective. Challenge false narratives. Keep track of situations where you were falsely accused and look for patterns of manipulation. Establish boundaries. Refuse to engage in conversations that force you to defend yourself against baseless accusations. Trust your self-perception. Remind yourself of who you are outside of the manipulator's influence and rely on evidence, not emotional manipulation. Dark triad. Anchoring is a deeply deceptive and damaging form of psychological manipulation that warps a victim's self-perception and erodes their autonomy. Recognizing its signs and employing defensive strategies can help individuals resist the effects of this toxic tactic, regain their confidence, and reclaim their personal identity. The empty vessel phenomenon. How manipulators exploit emotional and identity voids. The empty vessel phenomenon describes a psychological state in which an individual is perceived or perceives themselves as lacking a solid sense of identity, beliefs, or emotional depth. Manipulators, cult leaders, narcissists, and even corporate entities exploit this emptiness, molding the individual into whatever shape best serves their interests. This phenomenon is particularly dangerous because it creates a person who is easily influenced, controlled, and reshaped, often without their conscious awareness. Understanding the empty vessel phenomenon. The empty vessel phenomenon is rooted in identity erosion, where an individual's sense of self is either undeveloped, forcibly removed, or gradually replaced by external influences. People experiencing this phenomenon often struggle with self-definition. They rely heavily on external validation and direction, exhibit high levels of compliance. Without a strong personal belief system, they easily conform to others' expectations. Are prone to emotional absorption. They internalize the emotions, values, and perspectives of dominant figures in their lives. Experience chronic self-doubt. They lack confidence in their own thoughts, making them susceptible to external authority. Seek meaning in external structures. They often gravitate toward ideologies, relationships, or organizations that provide a sense of purpose. Psychological mechanisms behind the empty vessel. Phenomenon. Several psychological factors contribute to the development and exploitation of the empty vessel phenomenon. Identity suppression. A manipulator systematically discourages independent thought and self-expression, replacing it with externally imposed values. Emotional starvation. Those deprived of deep emotional connections may accept any ideology, relationship, or system that offers belonging. Cognitive dependency. Over time, individuals stop trusting their own reasoning and instead defer to external figures for decision-making. Social reinforcement. Group settings amplify compliance, making it easier for external influences to cement control. Fear-based programming. Manipulators instill fear of rejection, failure, or punishment to maintain control over the individual's psyche. Real-world applications of the empty vessel phenomenon. The empty vessel phenomenon is frequently observed in various forms of psychological manipulation, including cults and extremist groups. New recruits are often stripped of previous identities and refilled with the group's ideology. Toxic relationships. Abusive partners mold their victims into submissive, dependent individuals who lack self-agency. Corporate and consumer manipulation. Advertisers shape consumer preferences by reinforcing the idea that self-worth is derived from external purchases. Political and social movements. Some organizations exploit emotionally vulnerable individuals by providing a sense of belonging in exchange for blind loyalty. Parental over-control. Overbearing parents suppress individuality, creating children who struggle with autonomy as adults. Consequences of the empty vessel phenomenon. The long-term effects of being subjected to the empty vessel phenomenon include loss of personal identity. Individuals struggle to define who they are outside of the influence they've absorbed. Increased vulnerability to manipulation. Without an independent belief system, they remain susceptible to control. Emotional instability. A lack of self-awareness leads to chronic insecurity and dependency on others for emotional stability. Difficulty in decision-making. They rely on others to guide their choices, fearing personal responsibility. Struggles with authentic relationships. Their interactions are often based on adaptation rather than genuine self-expression. Defending against the empty vessel phenomenon. Breaking free from this psychological trap requires conscious effort and self-development. Cultivate independent thought. Engage in activities that strengthen critical thinking and personal reflection. Build emotional resilience. Learn to validate emotions internally rather than relying on external approval. Establish personal boundaries. Recognize when someone is trying to impose their beliefs or values onto you. Seek self-discovery. Explore interests, passions, and beliefs that resonate on a personal level. Surround yourself with empowering influences. Engage with individuals who encourage personal growth and independent decision-making. The empty vessel phenomenon is a dangerous psychological state that leaves individuals highly susceptible to external influence and control. Whether exploited by relationships, institutions, or ideologies, this phenomenon strips people of their autonomy and identity. Recognizing the signs and taking proactive steps towards self-definition, emotional resilience, and critical thinking is essential for reclaiming personal agency and building a stronger, more independent self. The compliance paradox. How manipulators use agreement as a control mechanism. Compliance is often viewed as a positive social trait, facilitating cooperation, harmony, and order. However, in the hands of a manipulator, compliance can be weaponized to create a cycle of increasing obedience. The compliance paradox refers to the psychological trap, where an individual, by agreeing to small, seemingly harmless demands, finds themselves gradually controlled by increasingly unreasonable expectations. Over time, this process erodes autonomy, making the victim more susceptible to exploitation. Understanding the compliance paradox. The compliance paradox operates through a slow and calculated approach, ensuring that the victim does not immediately recognize they are being manipulated. Each small concession reinforces a pattern of obedience, conditioning the individual to accept larger and more intrusive requests. Key characteristics of the compliance paradox include foot-in-the-door technique. Manipulators start with small, seemingly innocuous requests before escalating to greater demands. Cognitive dissonance and justification. The victim rationalizes their compliance, believing they are making independent choices. Gradual boundary erosion. Over time, personal limits are repeatedly tested and weakened. Fear of rejection. Non-compliance is met with guilt, isolation, or punishment, reinforcing submission. False perception of control. The victim believes they are willingly participating, even when subtly coerced. Psychological mechanisms behind the compliance paradox. Several psychological principles contribute to the effectiveness of the compliance paradox. Commitment and consistency principle. People feel psychologically compelled to maintain consistency in their behavior, making them more likely to continue complying once they've started. the sunk cost fallacy. The more effort or time invested in compliance, the harder it becomes to say no. Social conditioning. Cultural norms often emphasize the importance of agreement and cooperation, discouraging resistance. Gradual desensitization, repeated exposure to increasingly unreasonable requests, normalizes the manipulator's control. Guilt and obligation triggers. Victims are made to feel selfish or ungrateful for questioning compliance. Real-world applications of the compliance paradox. This manipulation tactic is found in numerous areas of life, influencing behavior and control. Toxic relationships. An abusive partner may start by requesting small sacrifices before demanding complete control. Workplace exploitation. Employers gradually increase workload expectations without appropriate compensation or recognition. Cult indoctrination. Members comply with minor rules before being subjected to extreme ideological demands. Political and social influence. Governments or organizations encourage small policy acceptances before implementing larger restrictions. Family and peer pressure. Parents, friends, or family members subtly push an individual into a pattern of compliance that benefits them. Consequences of the compliance paradox. Long-term exposure to compliance manipulation can have profound effects on an individual's mental and emotional well-being. Loss of autonomy. The individual gradually surrenders their decision-making power. Erosion of self-identity. Compliance reshapes personal values to align with the manipulator's expectations. Chronic stress and anxiety. The pressure to conform leads to mental and emotional exhaustion. Reduced critical thinking. The victim becomes accustomed to obeying rather than questioning. Vulnerability to further manipulation. Once conditioned, the individual becomes easier to control in other aspects of life. Defending against the compliance paradox. Breaking free from this psychological trap requires awareness and assertive resistance. Recognize the pattern. Identifying small manipulations early can prevent larger-scale control. Reestablish boundaries. Clearly define personal limits and reinforce them. Challenge justifications. Question whether compliance is genuinely beneficial or merely a conditioned response. Seek external perspective. Trusted friends, mentors, or therapists can provide clarity and support. Practice saying no. Developing the confidence to refuse unreasonable requests strengthens autonomy. The compliance paradox is a subtle yet powerful manipulation technique that exploits natural tendencies toward agreement and cooperation. By gradually escalating demands, manipulators can erode an individual's autonomy while maintaining the illusion of voluntary participation. Recognizing this tactic and actively resisting incremental control is essential for preserving personal agency and mental well-being. Awareness, critical thinking, and boundary enforcement are the key defenses against this insidious form of psychological manipulation. The Benevolent Trap. How feigned kindness is used for manipulation. Acts of kindness and generosity are typically seen as virtuous traits that foster trust and cooperation. However, when used deceptively, these traits can become powerful tools for manipulation and control. The Benevolent Trap is a psychological tactic in which manipulators weaponize kindness to create a sense of obligation, guilt, and compliance in their targets. By presenting themselves as selfless benefactors, they mask their ulterior motives, ensuring their victims feel indebted and hesitant to resist their influence. Understanding the Benevolent Trap. The Benevolent Trap operates by creating an illusion of goodwill and generosity while subtly enforcing control over the recipient. This manipulation works because humans are socially conditioned to reciprocate kindness, making it difficult to reject, question, or set boundaries against those who appear caring and supportive. Key characteristics of the Benevolent Trap include excessive or unsolicited generosity. The manipulator provides lavish favors or emotional support without being asked, subtly creating a sense of obligation. Guilt induction. The victim is made to feel selfish or ungrateful if they do not reciprocate or comply with the manipulator's expectations. Emotional debt creation. The manipulator ensures that their acts of kindness accumulate, fostering an unspoken expectation of future compliance. Conditional support. Help or assistance is only given when the manipulator believes it will benefit them later. Subtle boundary violations. The victim feels compelled to sacrifice personal needs in order to avoid appearing ungrateful. Psychological mechanisms behind the benevolent trap. Several psychological principles make the benevolent trap a particularly effective manipulation tactic. The reciprocity principle. People feel obligated to return favors, even when they didn't request them. Cognitive dissonance. The victim struggles to reconcile their discomfort with rejecting someone who has been so kind to them. Guilt conditioning. The manipulator subtly reminds the victim of their generosity, making refusal feel morally wrong. Intermittent reinforcement. Occasional, genuine acts of kindness keep the victim hopeful, reinforcing continued compliance. Loss aversion. The victim fears losing the manipulator's support or friendship if they resist. Real-world applications of the benevolent trap. This manipulation tactic appears in many social contexts. Toxic relationships. A controlling partner showers their victim with affection, gifts, or financial support to create dependency. Workplace exploitation. Employers use favors or incentives to discourage employees from setting boundaries. Family and parental control. Parents use financial or emotional support to maintain control over their children's decisions. Religious and cult influence. Groups provide unconditional love and support to new recruits, creating loyalty and dependence. Political and social manipulation. Leaders or influencers use grand acts of generosity to appear altruistic, while expecting unwavering support in return. Consequences of the benevolent trap. Victims of this manipulation often experience severe psychological and emotional consequences, including emotional exhaustion. The constant need to reciprocate or comply becomes mentally draining. Loss of autonomy. The victim's choices are influenced by guilt rather than genuine personal desires. Inability to set boundaries. Fear of seeming ungrateful makes it difficult to say no. Dependence on the manipulator. The victim relies on the manipulator for emotional or material stability. Chronic guilt and anxiety. The victim experiences persistent feelings of obligation and stress. Defending against the benevolent trap. Recognizing and countering the benevolent trap requires self-awareness and boundary reinforcement. Acknowledge manipulation patterns. Recognizing excessive or strategic kindness as a control tactic is the first step toward breaking free. Reframe acts of kindness. Understand that true generosity comes without expectation or pressure. Set and maintain boundaries. Clearly define personal limits and stick to them, regardless of guilt tactics. Challenge the sense of obligation. Remind yourself that you are not required to repay manipulation disguised as kindness. Seek external perspective. Talking to trusted individuals can help identify and validate manipulative behaviors. The benevolent trap is a deceptive psychological strategy that exploits kindness, generosity, and social reciprocity to gain control over others. By recognizing its patterns and actively resisting manipulation through boundary setting and awareness, individuals can reclaim their autonomy and protect themselves from emotional coercion masked as goodwill. True kindness exists without expectation, and breaking free from the benevolent trap requires learning to distinguish genuine support from calculated generosity.